Okay, so welcome to
Sorry, I
this.
still can't hear. Um,
Well, let's keep trying.
oh, I can hear now. It's fine.
Right. Okay. So welcome to this evening meeting to discuss David Collins's visit to Argentina. The meeting is arranged by the Movement for the Abolition of War, otherwise known as MAW. Most people here are part of it or know of it, but just to indicate that we are a small national peace organization founded by Bruce Kent and many others not long after the Hague Appeal for Peace conference in 1999. So we've been going 25 years and we've done a lot of things, and you can read all about it on our website, and you can sign up for newsletters and other kinds of communications. But David Collins is one of our board members, and he's got a very special story to tell, and I think it's going to be a really fascinating discussion. Um, Britain and Argentina go back a long way. I looked it up, and there are diplomatic relations from 1823, but David says it goes back earlier than that. And certainly we were involved in very heavy economic investment in Argentina in the 19th century. So although it's a long way away and it doesn't it's not on the radar much, our relationship with Argentina, is a deep one. And of course, it got even deeper during the Falklands War. And this is the background to which David is going to discuss tonight. He's recently come back from Argentina and has met with some of the veterans from that war. That David, is an international member of Veterans for Peace himself, and he was, in fact, in the Falklands some years before the war took place in his role in the Marines. So I think, his perspective is a very interesting one. And in fact, you can read more about it soon because he's writing a book about the causes of the conflict, and no doubt, some of his reflections on his recent visit. Just let me add one more available resource, shall we say, which is that there was a recent Radio 4 radio program called Reliving History, which was a fascinating theatrical reenactment of scenes from the war played by veterans who took part in it. I mean, quite an extraordinary thing. And in fact, it was shown at the Royal Court Theatre in London a few years ago, and I'll try and find the link to put it in the chat for you, in case you want to follow that up. It's one of several very interesting resources available for those interested in what happened and the aftermath and the implications and so on. So here we are. That's the BBC link to that presentation about the theatrical reenactment. But back to David. He's going to introduce himself a bit more, I think, and his background in relation to Argentina. So without more ado, I'll hand over to you, David.
Thank you very much, Colin, for that very nice introduction to this talk. Well, yes, I was in the Falkland Islands from 1973 to 74 in charge of a very small Royal Marine detachment, which was only 37 men, and we were responsible for protecting the islands, which are half the size of Wales, with nothing but small arms and no means of really resisting any form of attack at all. But on return from the islands, and I left the Royal Marines in 1979. The war started 3 years later, and I've always been extremely grateful. I was left before that war because I would have undoubtedly been sent there, being one of the few people who had been to the islands beforehand. Can we have the first slide, please? So this is just roughly what I'd like to speak about in the first part of this talk. And it's a mixture of impressions of Argentina and Buenos Aires and the time I spent with my conscript friends out there, and also something about their history. I was really trying to find out from an Argentinian point of view what they really think about the islands, what they think about Britain, and how, in fact, we could move forward and bridge the gap which still exists between the two countries. So can we the next slide, please? So let's start off by finding out where these islands are. They're 12,700 kilometers from the UK, 8,000 miles. And the Falkland Islands are that tiny dot in the left-hand corner. And the other little square that's been expanded slightly is all the other islands that are part of the Falkland Islands dependencies. And the islands are actually the same degrees latitude south as we are north. So it's a temperate climate, but it's accompanied by an 18-knot average wind speed and enormously high waves and sea conditions, and a water temperature of about 3 to 6 degrees. Next slide, please. So the whole story starts with the Spanish Empire, which includes all that part in the blue, right down through North America, through the South American states, and it includes the whole of South America, really apart from mostly Brazil and some of Colombia. And so Argentina is that very small section at the bottom, but a very large country. I think it's something like the 8th or 10th largest country in the world. And I think I'd like to can we have the next slide, please? I'd just like to look at this map and then go through a few dates which amazed me when I looked up the history of Argentina. So in 1806, a British naval force invaded Buenos Aires, and the Marquis de Sobremont, who was the representative of the Spanish Empire, surrendered after only 3 days. This was an interesting moment for Argentina, because it resulted in something entirely different from that expected by the British. The British made the mistake of forcing the Argentinians, or the Spanish mixture of people there, under an oath of allegiance to King George III. This outrage led to a formation of an irregular military force of Spanish soldiers, gaucho horsemen, and supported by the Catholic Church and a large section of the urban population. And this was the genesis of a separate Argentine Creole identity, as opposed to being split up into indigenous people, Spanish people, and other components of the population. And this guerrilla force that formed was of gaucho horsemen, were basically far superior to the British soldiers that landed, fast-moving, riding 3 horses each. They didn't stand a chance. Having retaken their Buenos Aires again, in 1807, another British naval force attacked Buenos Aires, but within 3 days was defeated by a civil militia waging urban warfare from the rooftops. In 1824, the Baring Brothers Bank lent over £1 million to Argentina, and that debt wasn't settled for 123 years. In 1834, Britain took the Falklands by force, it having been part of the United Provinces of South America, which eventually became Argentina. And they simply evicted the Spanish governor and took over. And from then onwards, the country has remained British. Then in 1838, a British naval blockade of the River Plate, which is right next to Buenos Aires there in the center. And then British commerce instead of military force now took the lead, building and managing communications and transport, most public services, and owning the largest estancias, the large shops, the financial system, and the colonization of the Falklands in 1841. Of course, the local name for the Falklands is Las Malvinas. And you wonder how it's possible to come to an agreement when the 2 countries haven't even agreed on a common name. So the first railway was built in 1857, and the British built an entire network, a huge network all over Argentina. And it remained British built, it remained British until nationalized by President Perón 1947. So in 1908, Britain unilaterally extended its sovereignty to all of the small island dependencies that we've seen in the previous slide. That's South Georgia, South Sandwich, and the South Shetlands. And in 1929, there was a huge financial crisis which largely destroyed the profitability of British investments. The other big thing was the massive immigration from Europe, mainly Italy, after both world wars. All the displaced people thought of Argentina as the new frontier, a place to start again. And the Italian influence is by far the largest to this day. In 1914, there was the Battle of the Falkland Islands, when 2,000 Germans and the entire German fleet was sunk, whilst trying to take over the Admiralty wireless station on the islands. And actually that wireless station in terrible condition was where our small detachment had its barracks. And so between the 18th and 19th century, more than 200 ships foundered on the islands. And this is because the islands actually are in a strategic position where rounding the Horn, very dangerous in a wooden ship when the Panama Canal wasn't built, led to a lot of ships limping past the islands and and sometimes wrecking on the islands, but aiming to be repaired by the rather rapacious shipbuilding firms on the island, to the stage where some would refrain from trying to land in the islands and wreck as a result. I mean, there are parts of its history where it was literally populated by pirates, people who had washed up from various ships. And of course, it became a very important center of whaling in the 19th century. So can we have the next slide, please? Now, this is the war of the maps, I call this, because the Argentina looks upon this area as its own. So you can see here the Falkland Islands at the top, and then to the east you have South Georgia and the South Sandwich. So this is all named as Argentinian, whereas a British map, which I'll show later, labels everything as British. So this in Spanish is the Pretensiones Britannicas in the Atlantic, in the South Atlantic and Antarctic. And Britain just increased that whole segment on its own. So can I have the next slide, please? Now, the interesting thing about the Argentinian view is this one is of the continental shelf, that instead of thinking of the islands as an offshore appendage that is owned by Britain, and Argentina being a landmass to the west of it, Argentinian thinking is that is the center of their empire. So you have Argentina, the Falklands, and then a big stretch of islands, and then the Antarctic, leaving the Falklands in the center. So next one, please. This is the British map, actually, which I don't believe would ever be reproduced today, because it also gives that viewpoint, which is that the islands are not just sitting there on their own, but they're part of an enormous archipelago. And this one was produced in 1972, and it actually shows the depth of the sea. It's a bathymetry map. So the Falklands are firmly in the continental shelf of Argentina and in shallow water, which, as we come to later on, makes it very good for offshore drilling. Can I have the next slide, please? Now, this slide here is rather bizarre. It's an actual map produced by the unfortunate military commander who was on the islands with the Royal Marine Detachment of about 60, because the two detachments were changing. One was replacing the other. And in the red is the advance of the Argentinians on the 2nd of April, 1982. And all of the blue, the friendly forces, are the Royal Marine units. So they had about less than 1 day's warning of the invasion. So they placed various people out in various points around Stanley. Stanley being the only town At that time, it had about 1,000 people in it. The invasion was thousands and thousands, about 10,000 Argentinian troops supported by aircraft carriers and several warships. And the whole thing was over in a few hours when the governor ordered the Royal Marines to lay down their arms and stop the shooting, which was in the middle of Stanley by Government House, making it extremely dangerous for the local population. So just to recap on the actual conflict, which lasted 74 days, 649 Argentinians died, 255 British personnel died, and 3 island women were killed by Royal Naval shells, and over 2,500 injured. And of this total, 321 of the Argentines died in the sinking of the cruiser General Belgrano, whose sinking by a British nuclear submarine really kicked off the war. Until then, it was possible to bring the fleet back to Portsmouth again. And many more on both sides suffered long-term mental and physical trauma, a significant number of whom subsequently committed suicide. And the Navy lost 2 frigates, 2 destroyers, a container ship, a landing ship, 10 fighters, and 25 helicopters. Whereas the Argentinian Navy, which after the sinking of the Belgrano went back to port, this is including their air force, it lost 37 fighters, 25 helicopters, 4 cargo aircraft, and 30 small aircraft. So it was a major episode in a protracted dispute over the sovereignty of the colony. And Argentina asserted and maintains that the islands are Argentine territory, and characterized the action as a reclamation of its own territory. And then the British government's opposite view was that it was an invasion of a territory that had been a crown colony of the Royal Navy, which had expelled the resident Argentine government in 1841. Now, the Falkland Islanders, many of whom have been in the islands ever since the early 19th century, are predominantly descendants of British settlers and strongly favor British sovereignty. And one of the most important factors here in this whole saga is that the homogeneity of the islands was established. In other words, no persons from South America or other countries were allowed to settle in the islands. So this early decision to only approve the naturalization of settlers from Britain or Scotland or in very few other places, that was and not to buy land or do business there. But that decision not to engage with that huge continent next door has been the loss of opportunity to trade with, speak the language of, understand and build trust with the island's nearest neighbors, where actually large British communities have lived and prospered for many, many decades. I mean, right now, of course, the islands have been restored to peace, are very prosperous, at the price of turning them into a military fortress. And more than a third of the people now living on the islands, even today, more than 40 years later, are UK military personnel. So next slide, please. So the story here begins with me interested in this saga with Ariel Martinelli, who is an Argentinian conscript who contacted Veterans for Peace asking for someone to help him translate his graphic novel called Tortas Fritas de Polenta, which is the story of a graphic story of his experiences in the war. And he, as a young teenager, was a conscript in the Argentine army. And when the war sort of reared its head, he was a taxi arrived at his house, moved him into the barracks, and thence after another week into an aircraft and shipped him straight across to the Falklands, along with thousands of other Argentine conscripts, and of course, some very professional troops that accompanied them. And he worked with his friend Adolfo Bayugar as a form of therapy after his experiences, which having read that book, I would say are comparable to experiences in the First World War, because they were dug into slit trenches, being conscripts. They weren't moving much. They had to sit there and take this enormous bombardment from the Royal Navy when it arrived, and the conditions deteriorated by the day. Food running out. They had to slaughter local sheep. They resorted to barter. It became a matter of survival instead of a military unit. So after taking on this role, eventually working with Professor McGurk and MacDonald Daly of Splash Editions, we translated the book and it was published in 2023 and it can be bought now on Amazon. So the next one, please. Now, when we finished the book, Ariel wanted to come to London, and so I offered him to stay in my luxurious flat on a folding bed in the sofa in my sitting room, which after his experiences in the Falklands, he considered to be the ultimate luxury. So we did that, and I organized a small sort of tour around London, but also I contacted some ex-soldiers from British soldiers from the war and asked them if they would like to meet Ariel in London. And so the Jan Coops, who had fought for the Welsh Guards in the war, said he would like to meet up. And he was on the Sir Galahad, which, as you may remember, was bombed and sunk whilst embarking the Welsh Guards after they just arrived in the Falklands halfway through the war. 56 of them were killed and 150 injured in the attack and the subsequent fire. And when we met up, we were in this very crowded pub in London. And I thought, this is definitely not going to work out too well because it's impossible to sit in a chair with the crowd. And then suddenly I saw these stairs, small stairs leading up to an upstairs room. And up we went, and there was a round table with 4 chairs round it, almost as if it had been provided by complete chance. We sat down, and I was the interpreter, which was, I can speak Spanish, but I've only been learning it for 5 years. But there was an immediate rapport between the two of them. And Jan Koop said that when he was doing his work, which is actually refurbishing houses, that whilst he did the plastering, he could actually see the faces of his soldiers that died on that ship. And he thought this meeting was just like part of the therapy for him, you know, on his sort of route to recovery. Can I have the next slide, please? This is some experience is in Buenos Aires. So this is the Casa Rosada with a white cabildo in the Plaza del Mayo. And still every Thursday, Las Madres de la Plaza del Mayo, those are the mothers of the people who disappeared during the years of the military government, in which there were 30,000 desaparecidos, which are the disappeared. And they still appear in this, I think some of them must be grandmothers by now, abducted by the state between 1976 to 1983. And they continue to march as a reminder of the past and other causes. Now, central Buenos Aires has beautiful, impressive government buildings, museums, art galleries, and one of the finest opera houses in the world, which has retained all its original fittings, built at the height of Argentina's former wealth between 1860 and 1930. However, many of these wonderful buildings are now interspersed with functional and often incompatible newer apartments. Next one, please. So this is La Biela, the restaurant where everybody meets up in the center of Buenos Aires. And these are Argentine authors Jorge Luis Borges and Cabrera. Obviously, if you want to, you can sit with them at the table and have your coffee. Next one, please. Everywhere you go, there are musicians. Next one, please. and extraordinary shops. And in the quarters, this one is La Boca, which were our old Spanish quarters and haven't been knocked down or marvelous colonial buildings built, have got an incredibly individualistic sort of style. Next one, please. I doubt if there's too many planning regulations, but the result is absolutely wonderful because you can see this particular setup. Next one, please. And can you play that? No sound. We can't hear the music there, but that the tango, of course, belongs to Buenos Aires. And what is even more charming than that particular exhibition is when you're sitting in a cafe, a young couple might saunter up and appear for a few moments by your table and do this beautiful tango. At this point, the currency has to be mentioned because the country has suffered an extreme inflation over the past years, amounting to sometimes over 100% in 1 year. And so you carry a colossal pile of notes with you when you're doing business, because you're not supposed to use US dollars. It's supposed to be the peso. But I believe that since Milei, the new president, has taken power, that his monetary policies have at least restrained the enormous rate of inflation. Next one, please. This is a demonstration which shows that the very big difference between today and the past. I still amazed to see Che Guevara still there, all these years later. This has nothing to do with the demo, but there's a very interesting twist where there is an Anne Frank Center. This is the diarist and Holocaust victim. He lived from 1929 to 1945 and died, in the camps. They have the Anne Frank Center because it's to them it used to be a house of refuge during the repressive years where people could hide from if they were being sought by the police. But it's interesting that they should connect with that, with Anne Frank and apply it to their own problems. There's also a house dedicated to the memory of Evita Perón, the First Lady of Argentina from June 1946 to her death in July 1952, because a sort of iconic figure, very well loved, and her house, the museum is full of her dresses and costumes. Next one, please. Sorry, that's the Evita Perón house, a beautiful room, part of that house. Next one, please. Now, this is the Museo Malvinas and Atlantica del Sur is the place where the background, the history, everything that happens connected with the South Atlantic islands and also the Las Malvinas are housed. And I'm showing you this particular one, which is a bit difficult to read, but I'll tell you what it means. These dates are all very significant, and it is quite revealing that the Argentinians don't try to hide the horrific background that they faced during the dictatorships. In fact, they face it head on. They present it to their own public and also allow anyone else from other countries to view it with a sense of shame, but they keep it there as a sort of reminder of what could happen again. And these dates, 1973 was a UN resolution to resolve the dispute. And in that year, the Argentines for the first time had built an airstrip on the islands. The British government couldn't be bothered to do that. And there were a number of very good things happening. When I was on the islands, there were Argentinian teachers. There was the possibility of secondary and even tertiary education in Buenos Aires. For the first time, as I say, we had an air link. Before that, there was only a sea link, and also fuel depots. But all this was viewed with extreme suspicion by the local people, as they were not used to Argentinians that didn't keep claiming their islands. The second date there, sorry, 1974. So that's the 1974 good period when things looked as though there might be an agreement over the islands with Argentina. So in 1976 was the end of democracy in Argentina, and the dictator started with President Videla, and 30,000 of Argentinians were disappeared. There was imprisonment, torture, exile, even this horrific practice of drugging prisoners, taking them up in aircraft and hurling them into the River Plate alive. Next, we come to 1980, where Britain actually agreed, in theory, a lease back, which meant that the Argentinians would get the sovereignty of the islands, but Britain would then lease the islands back for a set amount of time, so that they would continue their way of life exactly as it happened before with the British government, but with a British governor. And so that was a plan that could have worked, except for the complete rejection of it by the islanders in a very ill-managed sort of program, which included Nicholas Ridley, who flew out to the islands and put forward these suggestions, as it were, in 2 weeks in public meetings. And of course, the people of the islands, if you're on an island with only 1,000 people in the capital, you're going to be very careful what you say, because you'll live with whatever you've done, whatever age you were, for the rest of your life. Everybody knows everyone. So the only way to engage properly with this process would have been to have had a completely different and much longer term and more personal sort of program, where everything was explained in slow time. So in 1982, of course, we have the Guerra de las Malvinas, which is the war. Now, just to say here, Ambassador Williams, who was the British ambassador in Buenos Aires, on this point of consulting the islanders, made this statement. And at the end of his term, he was basically accused of not having his finger on the pulse and missing the fact that the Argentinians are planning to invade. This is in spite of the numerous warnings that came from his embassy or from the Falkland Islands and from other people. It really was nothing to do with him. But he said, knowing full well the current British policy with regard to the islands could not lead to any satisfaction of Argentine aspirations, and that the Argentine becoming increasingly restive, we refuse to face the fact that our encouragement of total intransigence from the islanders involves a physical risk to them, to counter which no adequate provision had been made or could have been made, nor did we make adequately clear to the islanders the stark choice they faced. They were never really brought face to face with the full realities of their position. Next slide, please. So this is the wall of the disappeared, and these are the faces of the young people mostly who disappeared during that dictatorship. And this is actually it's right next to the museum and part of the naval barracks where these tortures took place. Again, it's on show, and Ariel showed me that and said, you have a look at that. We also need to remember it. Next one, please. So now we're going to relax a bit more, and here is Ariel on the left, and we're actually at San Antonio de Areco, which for the annual gathering of the wonderful Gaucho people who still flourish and meet up every year at this center. Of course, one interesting point about, I'd forgotten to mention about the Falkland flag. Falkland Islands flag. In the early days of the colony, the emblem included a cow. However, it was thought that later on, the population of cattle on the islands was very great. There were thousands of them in those days, and they roamed free across the countryside, feeding themselves on the sort of diddle-dee, they call it. So there was a cow in the flag. But of course, with cattle, you require gauchos from South America. So it's sort of gradually, the cattle farming gradually phased itself out to be replaced by sheep, which of course are sort of the natural, herding of Scottish or English herders. Well, anyway, the Argentinians think that was a deliberate change to avoid having more South Americans in the islands. That could be open to some doubt. Next one. Can we play that? Thank you. Next one. So this parade of horses continued for really the whole day. There were literally thousands of these horses. They were able to, the riding is absolutely superb. It looks as though they're born in the saddle, and I cannot believe that the gaucho tradition is not just as strong as it was. Of course, I suppose mechanization has reduced their actual physical work, but all ages and all types of people were riding past. And those sort of small herds of horses. The amazing thing is, on an estancia which I stayed on, I asked the owner, these horses you have 60 horses, do you? So what is the reason for having this number of horses? His answer was nothing really. We just like them to be on the farm. They range up and down, they procreate, they don't do much. They're all broken in, they're not dangerous, so we just enjoy their company. It's quite a marvelous thing. The next one. Could you play that as well? This is a wonderful, charming dance in the street at that. Oh, yes. It's completely spontaneous by people who are simply standing around. Now, this, coming back to a more serious note, is in Puerto Madryn, which I went to try and see the whales which actually migrate during this time. And they call in a sort of inland part of the ocean, the South Atlantic, by Peninsula Valdez to calve. But this was also the port where all these soldiers, after their defeat by the British, returned in various hospital ships and other ships. And the whole town is carries that sadness. It's as you can see from this memorial, there's a fallen soldier being carried and another one seated, and the brown is the shape of the Falkland Islands. Well, whilst I was looking at that, everybody's very, very, very friendly and wants to know who you are. And my Spanish teacher says nobody can tell what accent I've got, which country I come from, which is it's either an insult or a compliment. So he said, "Where are you from?" And I said, "Britain." There was no animosity at all. We talked for quite a time. It turned out he was actually an ex-soldier from the war, but with no form of hatred, just wanting to welcome any visitor. So the whales that pass right past the town and can be seen all through the season are the right whales. And I actually took a small boat trip, and we floated right on top of one of these whales, which very helpfully descended to the bottom of the sea and didn't rise while we were passing over it. And we also saw the calf with the whale as well. It was absolutely entrancing. Plus, of course, penguins and seals. Next one, please. Now, on the islands after the war, many of the Argentines were buried in mass graves, and in their units, they don't seem to carry the tags that are the British soldiers always carry. The disc that British soldiers carry has their blood group, their religion, and their name on it. There are two. One is if they're killed, one of those is taken off, and a record is therefore there permanently of that soldier. But in the case of the Argentines, there was no way they could be identified, so they remained in graves without names. So solo conocido por Dios is known only unto God. I think it's known unto God in our First World War graves, I think. Next one, please. And when DNA became available, many years later, there was the possibility of exhumation and identifying these bodies. And that's been carrying on over the last few years until I think it's something like 95% of the Argentine dead have been identified. And there is the question of why they're buried on the Falkland Islands and not in their own country. Well, I did ask the questions whether the relatives would have preferred them to be buried near their own homes so they could lay flowers. But such is the sort of desire to once again regain the Falklands that they feel that having those graves there is part of they died there, they belong to it. And actually it's Argentina anyway. So that's why they remain there. But there is heart-wrenching visits occasionally by the Argentinian relatives. And I am very sorry to say that their reception from some of the population of the Falklands is not really appropriate for the sorrow they feel. At best, it's simply isolation, which is a great shame. Next one. On a lighter note, or perhaps even a sadder note, I'm not sure. This is Tom, and he's a dog hero who was smuggled on board the C-130 aircraft when the Argentinian soldiers were landed in the islands. And he remained with an artillery group for the duration of the war, being very useful because he would bark every time that the British came near. He knew that could smell the difference between the British and the Argentinians by the amount of good food I expect that the British had compared with the Argentinians. But there was, right at the end of the war, there was the entire battery, I think, of 11 men decided to take cover in their trenches because they feared an attack or a bombardment, whereas the dog stood on a rock and barked. And well, they say by some, during that incident that if he hadn't barked, they would have been killed by the incoming shells or the attack. And so it says at the bottom of that, Tom saved 16 lives, and the fatherland will never forget him. Tom salvó 16 vidas y la patria jamás no olvidará. Next one, please. So now we're down in Mar del Plata, which is where Ariel's home is, and we went down there to. I went down there as his guest, and when I say guest, I've never been in company so warm and so welcoming as that of his family. And it's a tough economic life for many people there. They imports are extremely expensive. I mean, he had a washing machine. I wouldn't be surprised if it was less than 40 years old. It's all make and mend. There is a certain amount of, because of the economic circumstances, it's there is some robbery and some fear of that, and houses are very well locked up. But as far as making a living, it was amazing though that he instead of sort of expecting someone to help out or relying on social security, which is very scant. Small businesses would pop up, and Ariel had started a small shop and owned one part of a house. So they were all making out with an enormous sort of family spread to exist to make out in those circumstances. These are southern sea lions which are relaxing on the dockside in Mar del Plata. I think they're expecting some easy pickings off the ships when they come in, but they mainly sleep. It's a wonderful life they've got there. Next one. And here is a restaurant meal with these wonderful friends. And on the left is Ariel, and next to him is his friend Gaucho, who was in the slit trenches with him during the war. And on the right, his other friend who created the book. And, it was such fun with these people. Next one. This is Ariel and his friend in more somber mode when they're at one of these veterans meetings. They don't call themselves Veterans for Peace, but they certainly do the same work, if not a lot more, without the title. There's an enormous gathering of veterans, and they're part of that. Next one. So this is just near the end of the slides part of this, and this is HMS Endurance, which was the only British ship in the South Atlantic during my time there, and that was only there for half the year during the Antarctic during the summer. And the ship actually was instrumental in picking up a lot of information in advance of the war. It turns out it was denied at the time, but it turns out that the ship had a suite of intelligence gathering. So they could of equipment, and 6 or 7 people operating it, all fluent Spanish speakers. They would intercept signals, communications, and also other things there, and they would pass that back to GCHQ in Cheltenham, the government communications centre, or the intelligence centre for the UK. And actually, I can in the next part of this, I can tell you what the GCHQ said about themselves about the Falklands, the catastrophic failure to either receive properly or take into account the signals that came from the ship. Next one, please. Well, this one's just here to show you that's a telex that was sent with various warnings. When the ship was docking at various Argentine ports before the war, it was getting a frosty feedback as compared with the other visits. And when it went to the Chilean port at Punta Arenas, they said there that you can expect an invasion quite soon. They were quite clear on that. So those snippets, which could be said to be gossip and could be ignored, were sent over quite a few months, and the captain of the ship, Captain Nick Barker, was also campaigning to retain the Endurance, because the Ministry of Defence had decided to cut that ship, so there would be absolutely no ships whatsoever from the Navy in the area at all. So, but he was one of these not very common personalities in the forces who decides to eschew any chance of promotion and say what he thinks. Next one. And so this is him actually giving an interview afterwards. It's a little bit sensationalist, but I don't really, I don't know whether the word easily is right, but I would certainly agree with that particular sentiment. Next one. And this one is very interesting because it refers to the oil regime, and it's always been, people have always asked whether this entire thing is all about oil. The whole war was about oil, which I don't think it was really. Although in 1981 to 2, the oil price had risen sharply. And I've seen documents from the National Archives in which Thatcher writes, our priority is oil, not defense. But I don't think that was part of policy. But when we look at it, the Falkland oil reserves are of North Sea magnitude. And actual fact, there are 2 companies which have drilled wells and actually have applied to start drilling. We can go into that into more detail, but it seems a very out of step with today's thinking. The other thing it says in here is it assumes there will be a leaseback agreement and that sovereignty will be transferred. And this is June 1981. You know, so the idea of this handover and of the negotiations, which are then taking place just before the war, which I can answer a specific question on later as well, because those negotiations really were a precipice, you know, and we were going to fall over it if something hadn't been agreed at that meeting. Next one. So just to say the Falkland Island today, this is a sort of a few photos of the islands, the wildlife, the pristine air, the beautiful sea, but the absence of any trees and the howling winds. I mean, the squid catch, it's a squid-based economy in which 500,000 sheep, there are still 500,000 sheep, which amounts to less than 5% of the economy. There are 75,000 tourists, but the GDP per capita is twice the UK. The prey is the Ilex argentinus, the Argentine short-finned squid. And they've even managed to build, I mean, up till now, it's been charging other fleets to do the fishing. And very, very lucrative it is too. But now with their own boat, it will be even more. So there are about 3,200 people living in the Falklands, and they say that's from more than 60 countries, including 10% from St. Helena and 6% from Chile. But there are many Falkland Islanders who've been many generations on the islands, over 200 years. At the time of the 2016 census, they voted for 98.5% in favor of remaining British. You wonder why the census was taken at all, but it is a rather uncomfortable figure when you think there was probably only one Argentine on the islands and perhaps a handful of Chileans and no Spanish spoken right next to this enormous continent. I won't go into any more on all this right now. Perhaps there'll be some questions about the presence of British troops, the sort of you know, the effect of this fortress that's been erected there. And so that's the end of my sort of first part. I think I seem to have gone a bit too long, really. There's the islands. I should have showed this map earlier on, I suppose. And this one says it's an homage to the war, which is all in almost all of the governmental, you know, sort of statements that come out. They're constantly thanking the armed forces for their sacrifices in the islands. And it remains the most important thing in the island history. And there's a statue of Mrs. Thatcher. The streets are named after generals. It's something they're thanking Britain for from the bottom of their hearts eternally, as far as I can see. It dominates the whole conversation. I mean, as far as I always think, as a soldier, you don't have a political view. You sign over your independence and your choice as to what you do to the government, and then you go to war when you're told to. And if you don't do it, you will be court-martialed. I take the view that then what happens after that is that soldiers really should stand back from, because if you have to remember the dead, of course you should remember them, but if that affects everything you do, everything must remain exactly the same forever. I think this can be a serious impediment to progress. Grand, and that's me for the first half.
Thank you so much, David. That was really amazing and so comprehensive. You know, the history, the culture, the war, the military, the economic dimensions, and so on. I mean, we could probably spend the rest of the evening, but we really shouldn't be more than about another half an hour. So I see Rona is very keen to make a first question. So please go ahead, Rona.
Yes, thank you so much for your really fascinating talk. I wanted to ask a couple of questions. I'm hard of hearing, and at the beginning of your talk, there were, I think, 3, possibly 4 people who were unmuted. So I was really struggling to kind of keep up to the thread of the beginning of the lecture, because I couldn't hear very well and the captions were distorted. So when I was able to hear properly, as soon as I was able to hear, you were talking about the British invading Argentina in 1807. And then you finished your talk by talking about the fact that the people in Islas Malvinas actually worship Thatcher. They will be thanking her forever, and most of the people who live there are British. But I just didn't understand the beginning of the talk. I couldn't hear what was going on, so I didn't understand why the British invaded Argentina to begin with. So if you could explain that. Also, later on, you talked about a washing machine being make and manned, and I don't actually understand what make and man means, unless that was another caption distortion, make and manned. I never heard that phrase before. So those are my 2 questions.
Sorry, what was the first one? About the...
Why did they invade in the first place?
Oh, yes. Well, Britain was a power which decided, if it decided to take a country, it would have a good go at it. I mean, that first invasion was a small fleet under Popham, Commander Popham, was on his way to South Africa, and he landed there, did his stuff, and then he...
I'm sorry, I'm really struggling to hear you. There are quite a few people who are unmuted now, so your voice is very, very distorted, and I can't understand what you're saying, and the captions are distorted as well. So Colin and Gillian are unmuted, so I can't actually hear your reply. So I'm sorry. Could you repeat what you just said? Sorry.
Well, at the time of that invasion, British supremacy armed, the Royal Navy was almost unassailable. It was on its way to South Africa to undertake some work there. When they simply combined with the army that was in South Africa and suggested they might take out Buenos Aires as a very useful point. Instead of invading the whole country, why not just have the capital and simply operate from that? And they literally sailed over and assumed they would be able to take it. They did, but then they found that they were defeated by a superior local force. As part of the British Empire, they could take any country really, or try to.
Okay, thank you.
I'd say.
About the washing machines, David? What was
Oh,
the
sorry.
reference
Yes.
there?
Well, that you can't afford to buy a washing machine because it's imported in Argentina because of the exchange rate. So you have to repair this 40-year-old washing machine.
Oh, I see.
Oh,
Okay.
and everything else that you have to import as well.
I think the phrase is "make and mend," which was a slogan used in
Sorry,
the
right.
World War II in Britain, wasn't it?
Make and mend, it's a
Make
naval
and mend.
expression,
Yeah,
actually,
right.
because
Yeah.
A naval expression. Oh, yeah, it
I'm
came up
sorry, yes.
in the captions as "make and manned," and I thought it was a brand name that I
I think
I got very confused.
I think the sailors do some sewing when there's nothing, they're off duty on their bunks. Make and
Oh,
mend.
I see. I
It's like a
understand.
time off. Sorry.
Okay,
Yeah.
anybody got other
Jargon.
questions or comments you want to jump in with? Well, I mean, what about the obvious one? What are the lessons for today, David, about preventing wars and resolving wars and patching up old conflicts and throwing away old colonial attitudes? You know, what are the lessons, do you think, you know, in general terms?
Well, I think it's taking shifting resources into thoroughly understanding what makes other countries and other peoples tick, and then I mean shifting a very great deal of money towards that. Really understanding, knowing language, culture, assistance, and identifying the points which are going to cause conflicts in the future. And I'd say would be the key to this particular one, because this separation from the largest sort of land mass next to the Falklands is due to isolation and no language, no marriage, no commerce, no nothing else. It's also taking care. I mean, Callaghan, when he was prime minister, used to look at his red folder, and he said it's the small things that I look for, and if I see the slightest problem, then I address it straight away. It's not shelved or postponed till next week or the next year or anything else. I mean, yeah, that's not a very. Anyone else?
The next one is the Spates, Heather and Nigel.
Thanks very much, David. That's very interesting. Not so much a question as just a talking around the subject. My main memory of the time is that, apart from the tragedy of the Falklands overall, the worst thing for this country was it preserved Mrs. Thatcher's career. Yes. And all that happened since that Thatcherism did to our country. But I always remember that Friday afternoon when the invasion had happened and she was absolutely paralyzed and indecisive. It was Michael Foote who actually drove her into sending an expedition. And he had a kind of psychological reaction to the march of fascist jackboots and appeasement in the 30s, which made him speak. And the Tories were clapping him on the back saying, "You spoke for Britain today." And then Thatcher was liberated to actually take the incredible risk of sending an expeditionary force, which could have been an absolute disaster. And then there was a period of interregnum when nothing happened. And she was worried that the United Nations would get involved and there'd be talk about leasing them back. And that's why she sank the Belgrano, to make sure there was a war. And all that was, the end was, it preserved her career and destroyed Labour in the 1983 election. And we've all been suffering ever since.
And Enoch Powell said, "We'll now find out whether you are of what metal you are made of, Margaret Thatcher, the Iron Lady." Reagan said actually off the cuff that Maggie wants a skirmish when Haig was busy trying to arrange a peace deal, and then there was the Peruvian peace deal which was on the table, and actually on the point of being approved when we sank the Belgrano, and that the peace with it. You know, the other extraordinary thing is the first Sea Lord, whose father was killed he was the captain of the Prince of Wales in the Far East, and it was sunk by Japanese bombers in 1941, I think. He was on the dockside in Singapore and seeing, where's my father? And there's that tremendous trauma. He was first Sea Lord when this news came through about the possibility or the certainty of an Argentine invasion. He walked into the Commons, and there was Margaret Thatcher with her Foreign and Commonwealth people talking about what to do. And she said, well, that's very good timing, Admiral. Why don't we talk about what we can do? And he basically said, what can we do? And he said, we can send a fleet to the Falklands and recover the islands. And he said, furthermore, I think we should do, because otherwise, if we don't, this will be an example for the rest of the world that Britain is no longer, word can be respected. And it's almost past belief that he committed that very evening giving orders to the fleet, half of which happened to be in Gibraltar, actually, around Gibraltar in an exercise. They actually began to set sail with his orders, and the chief of the defense staff was out of the country, and he simply did it. And he says in his book, he said, this was my moment. And furthermore, my moment to put the Royal Navy back on its feet, because they were about to lose all their aircraft carriers to sail to Australia. After that, they got the two aircraft carriers cancelled and got two new ones, and everything changed. And then Margaret Thatcher's great sort of piece was, this is the spirit of the South Atlantic. So it was using these deaths, appalling, cock up before it and the deaths to sort of raise this sort of, in all sorts of other ways, in a quite a moral way, really.
Roger, you've got a question.
Well, it's not so much a question as a comment. We seem to be criticising Britain and supporting Argentina. I would just point out that it was a military dictatorship that invaded the Falkland Islands without warning, and contrary, really, I think, to the first article of the United Nations, which promotes the identity of nations based on self-determination of the population. And clearly the population of the Falkland Islands wishes to remain as part of Britain or part of the British territories. So I don't think we should be too critical of Margaret Thatcher.
Yeah. Well, the Argentines will be the first to admit that that was a complete disaster. I once had a chance to talk to the Argentine ambassador in London, and he said he began the conversation by saying it was a disaster. We're totally ashamed of it. It was a time, a point in our country where we were had this terrible government. So I don't think there's any. I don't think we can say they and everybody else admits it was a disastrous decision. The thing is the build up to this. It's like 15 years of negotiations, and no one could. The funny thing about the Falkland Island people is that they weren't all completely against some kind of agreement, but they found it very difficult to stand up and say it. And the people who were really keen on not coming to agreements were those who had a vested interest in the islands, those large landowners, those sort of MPs that decided they would back this, but they couldn't seem to address the other side of the coin. But if they did maintain this, stonewalling, that something might happen. I mean, the intelligence failures are absolutely atrocious. Before the 1982 crisis, the GCHQ had placed the Falkland Islands in priority 4, and then that's below every other single. That's off the scale. The crisis completely wrong-footed the GCHQ. At the time, there was no proper working system for the prompt reading and reaction to messages about the Falklands or the Royal Naval vessels or anywhere, and only 2 duty personnel for South America and 1 at weekends. But that's actually what GCHQ says about its performance today. It's not hiding it. But I mean, I ask you a question. What do you think about? Do you think it's after 42 years of democratic rule? Do you think that Argentina could be a good partner and there could be an agreement?
Sorry, are you asking me?
Yes.
I've really got no particular views on it. I just think that in terms of the United Nations Charter, that the population of a territory should be given self-determination.
Well, what happens if you've manipulated the population so there are no people from the nearby landmass at all? That's apartheid, really.
I don't think Argentina is that close to the Falkland Islands. It's hundreds of miles away, and we might as well.
It's about the same distance as the Brent oil field is from the northern tip of Scotland. And if some other country had sort of operated the oil field instead of us, I think we'd have had a few things to say about it.
Can I ask you, David, what was the attitude of your Argentinian comrades there to, the future, and whether there could be a movement that would push for a settlement, and through what method? I mean, what was their attitude to going forward with this seemingly completely irreconcilable positions?
It seems strange because on the one hand, they're incredibly warm, welcoming, nice people who want to get on with everybody. But there's this, they built this museum on the fact that there's, and that there are hundreds of school children going through it every day, saying that there's no question about the islands not being theirs. But I do think a construction can be put together where the islanders could remain, have their lifestyle. And I mean, that's what was proposed before, actually, but have some nominal transfer of sovereignty. I mean, I don't think all that many people who, I think a lot of people have emigrated to the Falkland Islands because their conditions in other countries are very bad. And in the case of Zimbabweans, they were invited because they were good at lifting mines, to be honest. But why is it now that what's to be frightened about having Argentinians on the island and starting to look as though you could return to 1973 when there was a communications agreement and educational transfers and a lot of good things happening. Start at that level and just see how it goes. Everybody gets used to everybody else.
Nigel.
Have you got any feelings for how Argentina is doing under its current president?
Actually, they didn't seem to want to talk about him much. I think he's, I think previous governments have been very socialistic and Peronistic, which is, something that we would aspire to, looking after people, making sure wages are good and all the rest of it. But unfortunately, the economy is in a very bad state.
Is it getting worse or better under him?
Well, I think the country is now qualified for an IMF loan, which, whether that's a good thing or not is another matter. But that means their economy is getting some kind of recognition in the international finance as being viable. So that could help, I imagine. But I mean,
John
there's freedom of
wants to
speech.
come in?
There's no sign of repression. They don't complain of repression at all. They simply get on with their own things. I think many people think we aren't going to be able to rely on the government much. We're just going to make out on our own.
Poverty levels have increased dramatically, I think, under Millet. I mean, he's an
Yeah.
extreme libertarian conservative.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah, absolutely.
Anyway, John wants to come in, I think.
Yes, sorry, I've had problems with communication, but fascinating, and I've learnt a lot or been reminded of a lot. I think most people were unaware, and certainly are unaware today, of the negotiations which went on beforehand, and the fact that the Argentinians actually built an airstrip in Port Stanley. It's a fascinating story, but anyhow, my question is a very specific one. I think way back you did actually refer to a 1972 British map, and were you saying that map, which was a Bathurst something topic map, that actually showed a different version of who owned what in the South Atlantic?
Well, yes, I think so, because in terms of the perspective, if you just show the islands and Argentina, it looks as though, well, they're a couple of 300 kilometers, 350 kilometers offshore. So what's the problem? But when you show the whole thing, the fact that South Georgia and South Sandwich and South Shetlands are all part of the same thing, then it looks as though it's a bit ridiculous that Britain has this enormous area of the Southern Oceans when we are 8,000 miles away from it and incapable of developing it, helping it, or doing anything else, as we proved completely whilst we were there. And only the Argentines. Can you imagine the islands with absolutely no roads? You had to drive across the peat bogs to get anywhere, and then no airstrip, waiting for the Argentines to build it. You had to get onto a ship to go to the Argentine, and a very tough life. I mean, the people are wonderful, the ones I met there. Very, very self-reliant. You can't get parts, and you've got 6 months notice to get it shipped from the UK. So it fosters a very, very helpful and nice, tough kind of, type of people. Alcoholism, of course, is, I think, would have done for the islands. That was the one problem, because you really don't go anywhere if there are no roads and no trees, no lakes. I mean, albatrosses are wonderful, but there's a limit to the entertainment. Yeah?
I think Roger wants to jump in. The other Roger.
I think, David, you've made a case for the fact that there is I won't say it's a fact, but that there's the opportunity for something that could be mutually beneficial between the islanders, who have I guess you could say by now, a multi-generational right to have a big say in the future of the islands, and something that was actually more internationalist in outlook. One of the problems there, though, is that you're stuck with the nation state sort of principles. It's one or the other, and the idea of anything that's some sort of fusion is very difficult to envisage.
We had them under the empire, Egypt was a condominium.
But we did things so much better when we were running the empire, because we let the local we were basically an economic operation, and we didn't. The military were there to support an economic adventure. So I think the case is there, David. I think you've made it. And the other side of the argument, of course, is that we've got 4 typhoons there. At what it cost 90 million quid a piece, or something like that. They're sitting on the island waiting for something to happen.
You also got a ship down there, and if you've got one ship, you need 3, because it's the same with aircraft, artillery, and all the rest of it.
Yeah, and the big mistake was letting go of the first ship.
They've had to put the barracks 65 kilometers away from the capital, because even with 37 Marines, it completely upended the social balance.
I bet it
i.e. that there were not enough women in the first place. And
yeah.
having that number there would be, it's a very delicate small community, or was then.
Yes, I think that's the kind of argument that is obviously very difficult to fix, isn't it? That one.
Yeah.
Just can I just throw in an interesting thing, because when I worked at Kew, one of the specimens that we used to show people was a Darwin collection from the Falkland Islands, the Hebe in particular. Darwin was there in 1833. I just checked the dates, and there's a really interesting little side note to that, which I never knew, but you provoked me into looking, which is that the Falkland Islands fundamental geology is of enormous interest, because Darwin recognized that there were fossils there that looked very like fossils seen in South Africa. I don't know whether that was all in the
no, that's great.
same journey that you described. No idea. Was it?
I think it's part of didn't it, South America split from South Africa, and these bits that are left there are the Falklands, sort of.
It's apparently it's exceedingly complicated, but one of the questions is they obviously were in some sense united, and then continental drift has parted them. But there's one of the theories, and apparently there's more than one, about the Falklands, which are now rotated sort of 180 degrees in the process. But one of the things about the Falklands is they may have had their own separate plate.
Really, my goodness.
Across, which is just an interest. Sorry, this is completely
perhaps it could,
the main story.
Perhaps it could be unscrewed from the plate and taken back to Britain.
Yes, exactly. You could
There's also the mystery of the Falkland Island fox, which
yes.
they eliminate. It was, of course, obliterated, but that was a fox that's never been found anywhere else.
Really?
No. So what is that?
There's one more hand up. The other, Roger.
Yeah,
go ahead.
I'm not sure about the Falklands fox. There was certainly a Falklands wolf, and I believe that we had cousins on the South American mainland. But during the Ice Age, there was an ice bridge between Argentina and the Falklands, and that's how it got isolated there. So I believe.
Right.
Excellent.
Okay.
Well, from the distant past to the immediate future, I mean, I'm wondering if we could round off soon, but with a thought to, having made, a strong case for a different kind of relationship and a different kind of governance and so on, who is going to make this case? Where are our allies in each country who could be mobilized? Is there, for example, a parliamentary group on the Falklands here?
Oh,
I mean,
yes.
are there any MPs that are actually interested? What are the other social forces, we could work with?
The very powerful group of MPs who repeatedly visit the islands, but they do tend to go there and say this is British and it's never going to change ever, ever, ever.
That's what I was afraid of.
I mean, there were 14 of them in one group and another 7 the week before, just in the last 2 months. It's like a kind of a wondrous place to visit and sort of look as though I'm afraid it's a bit like sort of I'm honouring the magnificent victory sort of thing almost. It sort of makes it ever more difficult and piles on the kind of separation from Argentina, because it looks like a sort of well, we don't care what you think, we're going to just carry on the same way.
Yeah, and the current mood of nationalism, not just here but all over the world, rather encourages this digging in your positions.
There must be some MPs that don't think that, I think. I mean, we once had Pam DL and other wonderful people like that.
Right, yeah. R.I.P.
Sorry.
I think Roger's he's got his hand up again.
Yeah, what's the sort of age distribution of the population? Is it a population that's getting older and older, or is there a lively sort of birth rate going on?
Well, I looked that up, and I don't know whether an average age means anything, but it's 38 apparently. And it used to be catastrophic. I mean, before the invasion, they could have just waited for another 10 years, and it would have
petered out.
It would have petered out almost, because people were leaving because Um,
Well,
but
you
no,
say the standard of living is very high, and there's oil coming. Oil will bring people, surely.
certainly will. Yeah.
So,
Totally bizarre. It's actually going for 100% renewable energy whilst developing two very large oil fields, which is tiny
just
bit.
like China.
That
Have it
surely
both
can't be
ways.
good for your reputation, but of course that's changed now, isn't it? So it's becoming. I wonder if Trump couldn't. Maybe you should tell Trump to take a look.
Oh, please. I was hoping we could get through the whole discussion without mentioning that name. I think we're gradually coming to an end now, unless somebody is sort of bursting to sort of go down another avenue. It has opened up so many different questions, David. It's a very rich presentation. Thank you so much for
Sorry, it's a bit
doing
random
that.
times.
But I think you know, the slideshow is available. Is that right? Or the whole talk is recorded, of course.
I've got notes, but I haven't done a verbatim thing of it.
Right. Well, perhaps people could be in touch with you personally if they wish to, you know, follow this up.
You might be interested in the answer to the overriding question for the Franks inquiry on this, which is you know, an exhaustive interviewing of about over 100 people connected with this. Could the present government have prevented the invasion of the 2nd of April 1982? Noting that Thatcher had been in power for 3 years before. Taking into account these considerations, blah, 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 we conclude that we would not be justified in attaching any criticism or blame to the present government for the Argentine junta's decision to commit its act of unprovoked aggression in the invasion of the Falklands on the 2nd of April 1982. So, you know, you're moving that to, could we have stopped somebody in Buenos Aires taking a decision to,
Well,
and ignoring the entire history of the build-up to this? It seems.
there could
Callaghan
have
said,
been, there might have been, there should have been. These are all very speculative, aren't they?
Sure, yeah.
Look, I think it's time for a drink or something around here anyway. Thanks everyone for attending, and you know, let's follow up, you know, by email and so on, and maybe you have other subjects. We could make a series of webinars. Who knows?
Who's next? I want to hear the name.
All sorts of possibilities,
Not
but
me.
I think you have to write into the Secretariat to
John, look, you
get
look
an
as though you're
idea
ready for
across.
the talk.
Yeah, well, there's a lot of talent around the table here. We'll see where we go next, but keep in touch with us. I think we still have Facebook, don't we, Tim? Or are we Blue Sky now, or Tweet? What are we on? You're muted.
Certainly have Facebook.
Yeah, Facebook, Twitter, and Blue Sky at the moment.
Oh, right. Well, there we are. We're firing on all cylinders.
Thank you very much, David. It was a great talk.
Thank you, David.
Thank you.
Excellent.
Thank you.
Good to see everybody. Good luck with all your projects.
Okay.